First of all, thank you for being here, and of course, thank you for inviting us, Antonio and Julia. And Antonio, thanks for organizing this so wonderfully, and thanks to the first panel, which had an intriguing start into the debates, and I already learned a lot and saw already like themes that remind me of my own paper, and I think that's kind of a very good start. That's what we wanted in a workshop like this. So I will talk about geopolitical concepts of fascist regionalism in Scandinavia in the 1930s. This is a kind of side project coming from my PhD thesis, which I finished this year, on notions and activities of fascist internationalism in a broader sense, where I look at the cooperation and connections between fascist regimes in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, and smaller fascist movements in northwestern Europe. And today I will focus on two movements. The one is led by Vidkun Quisling from Norway, the National Samling, NS, and the other is led by this man, Fritz Clausen, a Danish fascist party. And with this, I come to kind of briefly outline the structure of today's presentation. I will start with the ideas of Nordic cooperation and Scandinavianism within the broader literature in transnational and global history, of course. Then I will briefly talk about the historical context and then discuss three phases in which ideas, concepts of Scandinavian fascist regionalism were discussed and articulated and developed. So the first phase until 1934, then I look at the particular event that also kind of coined and shaped ideas of Nordic cooperation among fascists. And then I come to the third phase and finish with a brief conclusion. So I build on in this paper and hope to contribute to three broader historiographical debates that are going on these days. The first one is to kind of look at Scandinavianism from a regional point of view, to take the concept of region as a starting point and develop it further. And there has been like a lot of examples of that. For instance, newer research on the pan-Scandinavian movement in the 19th century, or also on so-called Nordic cooperation between social democratic parties and governments later than in the 1930s in Scandinavia. But already this literature showed that the concepts of Scandinavia and Nordic cooperation, they are often vague, and it's not really clear what is meant with which concept. And my idea is to look at the fascist movements of that period, of the 1930s, and see how they used these ideas of inter-Scandinavian cooperation and how they also juxtapose these ideas with, for example, the social democratic enemies, as they would call them, the governments of Scandinavia at that time. The second historiographical discussion that I want to contribute to is the idea of fascist internationalism as such, which has been debated a lot in the past years. And here there have been, for example, a lot of focus on fascist Italy, which had this idea that fascism was a universal force that could be implemented all over the world. Thus, fascists had to unite kind of under the spiritual leadership of fascist Italy. And Nazi Germany had its own kind of racially based internationalism, if one could even call it like that, where they wanted to create something like a new European order based on their Nordic races agenda. And I now want to create a new focus by looking at regionalism to show how smaller movements, peripheral movements, develop their own ideas of internationalism and regionalism. And this, I would argue, gives us also ideas of new alliances within this kind of field beyond formally established discourses on fascist internationalism. And the third theme is, of course, also to look at this as a geopolitical concept. And that's why I also wanted to present this paper here, to see what thoughts we have and what I can learn from other papers in this regard. Brief talking about the context. Now we already had Sven's paper talking a bit about this part. I will focus on Scandinavia, the red countries here, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. These, of course, had historically been united in the Kalmar Union in the Middle Ages. And in the 19th century, there was a strong pan-Scandinavian movement inspired by pan-Germanism, pan-Slavism, that wanted the political unification of these three countries. And then in the early 20th century, the idea of political unification was rather replaced by the idea of cooperation between independent but allied countries and nation states. So for example, there was a civic group, Nordic Association, and as I talked about earlier, the Scandinavian labor parties and social democratic parties that wanted to engage in forms of closer collaboration between these countries. However, my main argument now is to show that fascist movements as well participated in this discourse when engaging with kind of social democratic ideas of Scandinavianism while developing their own understanding of why and how they should collaborate. And I do this by looking at two case studies. The first is the National Socialist Workers' Party of Denmark, which short the DNSAP, which was, as you can see by the name, very much inspired by the German NSDAP, and led by Fritz Clausen. And the second case study is the National Samling, the National Unity Party, short NS, headed by Wittgen Quisling. And these were, of course, diverse parties. However, what they shared, both the Danish and the Norwegian Fascist Party, was a kind of ultra-nationalist program, anti-liberalism, anti-communism, and an increasingly racist and anti-Semitic agenda. And what they also shared was that they both were very politically unsuccessful during the 1930s. They remained quite marginal. It took the Second World War and the occupation of Norway and Denmark by Germany to actually make these parties kind of political power players. And the NS even became a state party then in the Second World War. So let's talk about the concepts that they developed. So Wittgen Quisling was the first kind of Scandinavian fascist leader who discussed ideas of Nordic cooperation in his book, Russia and Ourselves, that we see here. And there he plotted or he juxtaposed Scandinavian and Nordic cooperation against the danger of the Bolshevists. So he argued that Russia was threatening the Nordic races, the peoples of the Nordic race. So hence they had to unite. And he even talked about that they had to create a Nordic alliance and a Nordic federation with a core Nordic entente, Scandinavia and Britain, but also Finland, Iceland, Germany, and later even like the British dominions that we also mentioned already today should be part of this alliance, united against Russia, and really based on this idea that the Nordic race was a civilizational barrier. We also heard that already this morning. So that was Quisling's main idea. Then the Danish DNSAP had a quite similar approach. They talked about what they called racial Scandinavianism. So they wanted, or they based their belief in the Nordic Germanic peoples as a racial unity. Hence, this unity should then also allow for a closer collaboration among fascist movements within these countries. So within Denmark, Sweden, and Norway in particular. And that's what they called true Scandinavianism, really much based on a concept of kinship, based on blood and culture. However, we see here already a first issue, the question who's actually belonging to the North, because Quisling talked about Iceland and Finland and Germany, whereas the DNSAP mainly focused on narrow Scandinavianism. And this was, of course, also rooted in historical differences, because Norway, as a country that had once been ruled by Denmark and later Sweden, was quite skeptical about narrow Scandinavianism. And there was a second issue actually regarding colonialism, because the Norwegian Fascist Party wanted to have the former Norwegian colony back, Greenland. And this was actually something that thwarted cooperation between these parties. So when the first time when Quisling, the leader from the Norwegian Fascist Party, and Clausen from the Danish party met, Quisling immediately argued about that Denmark had to give back Greenland. So we see here that kind of this historical revisionism based on colonialism really also complicated things. These two people actually met then at the so-called Montreux Congress, which was a congress organized by Fascist Italy with delegates from 17 European fascist parties. And the idea by the organization that organized this was to kind of unite fascist movements all over Europe as the Communist International united communist parties all over the world. And of course, that should be under Italian leadership, as the Soviet Union dominated the Communist International. And because of this conference, actually a lot of Scandinavian fascists then came to Montreux and met there for the first time and realized this kind of hegemonial objective of the Italian organizers, which they didn't want to participate in. So they together, Quisling and Clausen, in their speeches, they talked about the Nordic racist agenda of their parties. They talked about the importance of Nazi Germany, which had not been united in this conference. And they thus created even kind of a divide within this Congress between a camp that supported Pan-Latinism, Roman Latinism, and a camp that supported rather fascist version based on Nordic racism. And in conclusion, after this Congress, these parties now finally actually also engaged in practice in cooperation with each other. So they, for example, visited each other at congresses, they organized an exhibition together, and they exchanged propaganda material. So now we see also how concepts then have a practical input. And Wittgen Quisling was very much inspired by this, what happened at the Montreux Congress. He now believed that Fascist Italy was allowed to kind of lead a Latin bloc of the world when he kind of had spheres of influence in the world, whereas Norway should actually lead kind of a Nordic bloc. So he wanted to create a Nordic movement in Oslo. And this was then something he showed in a speech on what he called the Nordic World Federation, where he wanted to create kind of collaboration among Nordic peoples. And they should even like have a Nordic currency, political fiscal collaboration, and a customs union. And his belief was based on a division of the world in one socialist, liberalist, Jewish camp, and the Nordic peoples on the other hand. So this was his main belief. These were fighting an eternal battle. So all the Nordic peoples had to unite in this World Federation. This, of course, also had a military purpose, this plan, because it would kind of help to safeguard Norway and the other Nordic peoples from the from the Bolshevists. Again, thus the approach was pan-Nordic in the sense of that he wanted to include, and I quote, all peoples of Nordic race and outlook in every country. So this was even including the United States in his mind. So not just narrow Scandinavianism again, which was again something that Danish DNSAP disliked. So they heard about this plan, and then there was one leading member, Knut, who sent a letter to Quisling and argued that actually we should rather focus on Scandinavianism because that's more realistic and because these people were more related. And here we see also how theories of racism come in. Racial theories, for example, yes, thank you, inspired by a German racial researcher called Hans F.K. Günther, who argued that the racial relationship between the Scandinavian peoples was the closest, hence they should kind of start with cooperation and then it should kind of evolve into further countries. Nonetheless, there was a kind of intensification of Scandinavian fascist regionalism, and here it was also used in the later period as a kind of geostrategic demarcation against what the Axis powers, because fascist Italy, Nazi Germany kind of created the Axis, and this created new spheres of influence in Europe, and the Scandinavians feared that this would be to the disadvantage of themselves. So they now actually feared German expansionism, quite rightfully, as we know from the Second World War, and they used internal or inter-Scandinavianism as a kind of means to argue against German influences in the Nordic countries. And in particular, because of the Danish party, because there was a border issue with Germany in North Schleswig, and they used inter-Scandinavian cooperation to highlight their fight against the German national minority in Denmark. And this then actually led to institutionalization of trilateral cooperation between three different parties in that period. The two case studies I talked about from Norway and Denmark, and also the Swedish fascist party. And they organized events together. Again, they exchanged a lot of propaganda and they discussed these concepts of fascist Scandinavianism quite often. And they also now held their own kind of anti-Montreux, they held their own congress in Copenhagen after the outbreak of the Second World War, with delegates from these three countries, as we see here as well in this source. However, this could have been the starting point of more cooperation. But because of the Second World War, this kind of form of collaboration ended when Nazi Germany then occupied Denmark and Norway in 1940. And that was kind of the end of this form of fascist regionalism in Scandinavia. Now, coming to the end, I think there are 3 points that I want to highlight regarding these kind of concepts of Scandinavian fascist regionalism. The first is to say that these emerged in competition with social democratic Nordic cooperation, so that they were currently uniting against the common enemy, the Marxist governments and the internationalist Jews. But it also emerged in relation to fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, for instance, that they needed to meet first due to the Italians, and then they developed their own forms of cooperation. And it also emerged in relation to Nazi Germany, and partly also in distinction from them. And second, of course, this kind of form of regionalism was very much based on racial ideas of Nordic kinship and also ideas of fascist temporality, that they would kind of have a common Nordic history, destiny, and future. And as said earlier, also very important was the theme of common internationalist enemies, which were at some time even more important to fight against these enemies than to, for example, protect the own nationalist stance. And these concepts also helped to bypass territorial conflicts. So at the end of the 1930s, there was no talk about any longer about the issue of Greenland, for example. They came over that topic because it was now more important for them to unite. And this, I would argue, also foreshadows then collaboration of these parties with Nazi Germany, because they then said, instead of defending our countries against the foreign invader, we focus on our common racial basis, the Nordic Aryan race, and we fight together against our common enemies, in particular the internationalist Jews. So here we also see important continuities between the 1930s and the 1940s, and also until today, because that's often one argument that also nowadays neo-Nazis use, white supremacists, obviously, in the Nordic countries and all over the world. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.